Can you hear me at the back?
I can hear you well.
I'm not going to talk about this subject. I have talked about it many times before, and I have something more urgent to talk about today. Somehow.
The one on the right.
Yeah.
Oh, it's nice.
Yeah. This is how it all began for us, George and myself. George is on the right. My hair went grey. Why were we there? The Lebanese from California and the Englishman from Connecticut, Yale. What were we doing in Beirut? We were there because the leading scholar of Islamic astronomy and history thereof was at the American University of Beirut. He was the man who was fluent in Persian, was learning Arabic, and he reintroduced to the world Islamic sieges. Professor Glenn Cooper will tell us about sieges tomorrow. But if you don't know what a siege is, you are missing an important part of life. Planetary astronomy was his field. Al-Biruni he rediscovered after the old Orientalists of the 19th century. And Al-Kashi, one of the greatest Muslim mathematicians, our knowledge of them was increased by Professor Kennedy. And then George and I went to Barcelona and we met Julio Samso. You can see Julio. Oops. Julio's in the middle here. The Spaniards talk more. We met at Aleppo, which was the center in those days for the study of history of Arab science. Those were the good old days, not least for Aleppo. We collected Ted Kennedy's studies and put them in a single volume, published in 1983. 75 studies of him by himself and with some colleagues and with students, all in one book. And then George and I, you can see me helping George, we produced a Festschrift for Ted Kennedy in New York Academy of Sciences, 35 studies by the leading scholars in the history of science in that part of the world, ancient and medieval. AUB never recognized Ted Kennedy until recently. They realized how important he was, and so now they put up banners on the streets of Beirut, which is absolutely brilliant, and Ted Kennedy would have been so amused. His family has been very touched, but no, I blew it, sorry. That's right. No. If you don't know those two books, you can't begin to know anything about Islamic astronomy. That is Islamic astronomy in the second half of the 20th century. And so I was quite surprised to see a new book, 2016, appear in the Edinburgh Islamic Surveys series by a guy I'd never heard of, who promised the first accessible non-technical history of the subject, which is complete nonsense, because he didn't mention the two works of Kennedy and George. Incomplete. He said it was complete. He said it was going to be inclusive. He said it was going to be non-technical. Well, you can't talk about the Qibla unless you give a diagram and a formula. The bibliography is totally inadequate because the vast works of Saliba and King. We got one each. Cow. I think that's next. Now go back, please. Yeah. So my usual topic is what science served in Islamic civilization, but in particular with regard to the use of astronomy for religious purposes, calendar, timekeeping, and sacred direction, the Qibla. But I feel a need to talk about a different subject, because some false notions have appeared on the scene. And is Shafaya here? Shafaya Khodouri? Last autumn I received an email from Shafaya Khodouri. He said, I've heard of your interests, and I think you would be interested in this book. And he sent it to me, and it made me extremely angry. And we talked about what I could do to demolish the rubbish that is in this book. And I wrote the title on January the 21st of this year, which was a black day for the world. And this is what it's about. Early mosque orientations may be curious to the modern mind, and they are full of surprises. One of which is that these mosques were intended to face an edifice, the Kaaba, rather than the town of Mecca. How do you face an edifice you cannot see? Some recent claims, we need to learn how the early Muslims thought they were achieving this. Some recent claims that these mosques face Petra rather than Mecca are absurd. How many people have heard this nonsense? 1, 2, 3, 4. You heard it from me. Absurd. Likewise, a recent claim that the 5 daily prayers of Islam are taken from Zoroastrianism is fatuous. It's a lovely word. It means kalam farigh. To find the direction of the Kaaba, that's what's demanded in the Quran, you face Shatr al-Masjid al-Haram. Bayt al-Haram. You don't face the city of Mecca, you face that building. And the methods that were used by Muslim scientists and Muslim scholars to do that can be divided into 2 categories. Because the mathematical astronomers did it the way we thought they did it. They did it by mathematics applied to geography. The legal scholars and the vast majority of the educated public were not into that at all. They were into what we call folk astronomy, pre-Islamic Arab astronomy, astronomical knowledge, that was documented, for example, by Ibn Qutayba, Tab al-Anwar. It's all in there, all you need to know. By the way, there's an article, Islamic Astronomy, in the book published by the British Museum years ago. Nobody ever quotes it. It's the best thing that's ever been written. It wasn't written by George. But in that, for the first time, you have the dichotomy of folk science and mathematical science explained and the consequences outlined. This was the problem to get from, I can't use this thing, but to get from X to M, find the direction along the great circle, you want the angle Q, and the coordinates of X and M are known. They are the latitudes there and the longitude difference. That's all you need. Also the distances of it, D is of interest. And that's the solution. Don't bother to write it down. It's in the Encyclopedia of Islam, right there, under Qibla. It's not funny. It's out of date, but it's not so bad. Oops. The mathematicians were busy already in the early 9th century finding the direction of the Qibla at Baghdad by all sorts of mathematical means. They really had fun. And the one who had the greatest fun was this fellow who did it by by three-dimensional geometry. This is already in 825. Somebody in Baghdad is working out this problem by three-dimensional geometry. And this is the time when some people think that people were sitting around faking the hadith and faking the Quran and writing and burning this and that. You'll see some more of this. 825. And then my friend Al-Khalili in Damascus, he made a table giving the Qibla in degrees and minutes for each degree of latitude and each degree of longitude difference from Mecca. And those values in degrees and minutes are all correct in the main. We don't know to this day how he did it. When we published that was the first. Since then we have 10 Qibla tables from different parts of the Islamic world. Or lists of places where you have the names, the latitudes, longitudes, the Qibla and Hiraf, and the distance, 275 places in a locality near Samarkand. And those results are all correct. Come on, baby. In 1989, we discovered in London a map of the world centered on Mecca, at the middle there, and marked with places with dots and names all the way from Al-Andalus to China, and from Bulgaria down to Yemen. The grid that underlines this is accurate, and the goal of the instrument has been achieved. I wrote at the time, this instrument cannot be conceived in 17th century Iran. I hope there's no Iranians here, because the Iranians in Safavid Iran couldn't have done this. This has to go back to Baghdad, 10th century. Since then we have found two sources, Baghdad 11th century and Isfahan 12th century, 11th century, describing the theory of these maps. I don't like this thing. You do it? Yeah, if you can help, sure. Now, that's what the mathematicians did. Now the legal scholars, next please. They knew that the Kaaba itself, the Kaaba itself was a rectangular had a rectangular base, and that it was aligned in certain significant astronomical directions. The major axis towards the Matla' Suhail, the brightest star in the southern sky, and the minor axis in the direction of summer sunrise and winter sunset. This was discovered in the 1980s in a Yemeni text and was confirmed by satellite images. They developed this into a sacred geography, this notion into a sacred geography where the Qibla in each area of the world was organized into sectors around the Kaaba, and different Qiblas were given in terms of risings and settings. Now, it's small wonder that mosques face funny directions when they were laid out by people listening either to the astronomers or more usually to the legal scholars. And this is the situation recorded in medieval texts. And this is the legal scholars, their answer to it is they can face in any direction between 90 degrees like that, as long as basically you're facing the Kaaba. And that's very sensible. I tried to document all of this in this book that was generously subvented by the Al-Furqān Foundation. Now, the bad guys. They published this book in 1977, and they withdrew it, they retracted it 20 odd years later. I like to think that I was partly responsible for them retracting it. Because there's a lot of nonsense in this book. But the biggest nonsense is the statement that since the earliest mosques in Iraq and Fustat they don't face Mecca, they face somewhere in northern Arabia. Therefore, they were supposed to face somewhere in northern America, northern Arabia. But what they wrote influenced a guy who is a complete nutcase, in my opinion, who makes me very angry. He wrote a book called Quranic Geography, of which the principal theme at the end is all of these mosques, early mosques in the first 2 centuries of Islam, wherever they may be, they don't face Mecca. Well, they face Petra. Now, this is not good. This is very dangerous material. It has no scientific or historical foundation. He's written a book, he's written a text on the internet where he lists all of these mosques he's measured, and the pink ones face Petra, the most significant ones face Petra. But you know a funny thing? If you're a Muslim in the 7th or 8th century and you want to face Petra, you wouldn't know how to begin. You have no mathematics, you have no geography, and you have no idea about the outside world. So this diagram is rather important because it shows which Qiblas were used, and we have the documentation why, for example, the Grand Mosque in Cordoba faces the deserts of Algeria rather than the deserts of Arabia. That's because it is parallel to the axis of the Kaaba, which is very nice. That's one way of facing a distant building. Oops. This is winter sunrise, and this is the direction computed by the astronomer Ibn Yunus. Some of the buildings in central Cairo have two different orientations inside. The difference between them is 10 degrees. This explains why. Samarkand was the same thing. You had due west and due south. South is Shafi'i for the Shafi'is. It's the direction the Prophet was praying in Mecca. And west, due west for the Hanafis. Due west for the Hanafis. That's the road to Mecca. I want 5 more minutes. Okay? I'll pay you whatever you. I'll pay you whatever you like. Oh, he pays. So that's what they did. The astronomers, and that's what the legal scholars did. But now we have more trouble on the horizon. We have this fellow. Anybody ever heard of him?
Yeah.
Hands up.
Dan Gibson?
Yeah, 10. Not Gibson, no.
Oh, Holland.
This joker,
Oh, I don't
Holland.
know this guy.
10 people heard of Holland.
Only because if you told us.
I thought you were asleep. Now, Tom Holland is a Latinist from Oxford or Cambridge. And I guess he was out of a job because he decided what he wanted to do was to rewrite ancient history. So he wrote a book on the fall of the Roman Empire, which brought him in a fortune. Everybody wants to hear about that. And then he wrote another book about the Persian Empire. Everybody wants to read about that. And then he decided to write a book on the origins of Islam. And I leave you with the, just go to the internet, look Tom Holland, historian, and you'll see some of the stuff that he's written. This is not nice. Because when he talks about Zoroastrian influence in early Islamic practice, religious practice, he doesn't mention any of the writings of Orientalists over the last 100 years. And what was really annoying for me was he didn't mention me either. I wrote an article, 100 pages, on the origins of the institution of prayers in Islam. And I cited it. He didn't cite it. Let's have the next. There he is, young and
Now,
arrogant.
we've had mention of the fact that
Louder.
praying 5 times a day is not in the Quran. Now, that is a Zoroastrian practice. It seems to me entirely possible that that was smuggled into the Sunnah by Zoroastrian converts. What that means is that people now are still following Zoroastrian practice, but thinking that it is eternally from God.
You are still following Zoroastrian practices.
The original Arab followers of the Prophet. Somehow
This is a
a couple
Muslim-
of Zoroastrians convert to Islam, and then they come and say, hey, you guys, you know what, I think actually, weren't you guys supposed to pray 5 times a day? And they're like, oh, we don't remember that. We lived with the Prophet for 20 years, but I think maybe we should start this. That's just a preposterous idea, that somehow Zoroastrian converts to Islam convince all the other Muslims that they have to pray 5 times a day as an absolutely essential part of their religion, the one part that nobody disagrees on.
This is unbelievable. You want me to stop? Stop with the last picture. Where's the picture? The answer to this nonsense is in this book. And I'm not allowed to continue. And that was the end of the lecture anyway. But the call of the
allowed to finish that.
the call of the muezzin says it all. What I tried to do was document the way in which Muslims have used astronomy to regulate their prayer times, and ask the question, where does it really all come from, by looking at some of the curious definitions of prayer times that you find in strange places like Tunisia and Pakistan, to go back to the origins. So I thank you very much for your keen attention and for your excellence as a muwaqqiq. And George,